Well, good morning, First Christian. Merry Christmas to you all. It's good to see. I am once again one of the 5 people that haven't gotten sick, although I did get sick this week. But I recovered. It was a close thing. It was a close call. I recovered. And I have to apologize because you know that my job, my role here is to be canary in the coal mine. My job is to serve as a warning to the rest of the congregation. When I get sick, you know something's afoot. You know something's out there. You know you need to be careful. My job is to be the first one to get sick. I failed this time, and I apologize for that. I will rectify that next time. I will be the first one. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 8 today, so if you want to turn there. We've been going through our kind of home for Christmas theme here, our home for Christmas theme. We're talking about how what we're celebrating in Christmas is the incarnation of Christ. The fact that God tabernacled among us, that He made His home with us, that Jesus came and lived among us. And the reality is that that can be either more real in our lives or less real in our lives, depending on the faith that we come to that proposition with, the faith that we receive that with. And so this whole time, this whole holiday season, what we've been trying to do is to make that home with us more real, to make Jesus more at home with us, to have His home in our hearts in a more real way than it was before. And so we're talking about different aspects of that. We've been talking about a lot of different things, a lot of different aspects of home life, if you will. We talked about how home life involves chores, for example. Today we're going to talk about love and leadership, because in a home there is authority, there is leadership, and how we respond to that is very important for making the home functional the way that it ought to be. And so we're going to look at Matthew chapter 8 today. Now, we're not talking about exactly the Christmas story per se, because that's going to happen tonight. We're talking today about the implications of the Christmas story and the implications of Jesus making His home with us. And so in Matthew chapter 8, verse 5, we're dealing with a centurion. We're dealing with somebody who's a Roman soldier. And if you know the story of Jesus, then you know that there's all kinds of tensions, both in Jesus' birth and Jesus' death, with the authorities of the time. If you recall your Christmas story, that when the wise men, when they came and they were looking for Jesus, you remember that Herod, one of the rulers of the area, was very interested in the new king of the Jews being born. If you recall, Herod was not interested in worshiping Jesus, although that's what he claimed. He was interested in finding out where Jesus was so that he could destroy Him. That's not a good way to get started in your life with authorities. You know, to have your very birth be a thing that puts you at odds with them that's not a good way to go. And at the end of His life, of course, Jesus was put to death by the authorities. And so you might think to yourself, well, what is exactly Jesus' attitude toward authority then? You would expect that Jesus would be quite the rebel. But what you find all through Scripture is that that's not the case. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 5, we have this centurion who stands for a government that is at odds with everything that Jesus is about. And you have an encounter between him and Jesus that you would think would go one direction, and it goes someplace completely differently. So let's start Matthew chapter 8, verse 5. It says, when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, "Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly." And he said to him, "I will come and heal him." But the centurion replied, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he marveled, and said to those who followed him, "Truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith." I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And to the centurion Jesus said, Go, let it be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed at that very moment. So we're going to do some math today, and this is unusual. I went to a college that didn't offer a single math course. And so I will do OCC math, Ozark Christian College math, and that is there are no numbers involved. So the things we're going to go over today is, firstly, love equals authority plus submission. Next, we're going to go over faith equals trust in love equals authority plus submission. And then finally, what we're going to talk about is authority equals submission plus time. So let's talk about this, because I think that for us in understanding Jesus' birth and understanding the incarnation and what God is trying to accomplish with the incarnation and making Jesus home with us more real, this is going to be important for us. So let's talk about love equals authority and submission. You know, in order to understand really what authority is, we have a very difficult relationship with authority. And I don't know if you're like me, but I assume that you probably are somewhat like me. And the fact that as soon as the authority card gets played, that there's a tendency to not appreciate that very much. There's a tendency almost to want to go and do the opposite as soon as somebody tells you not to do something. And the reality is that all of us have that within us, some of us to a greater extent, some of us to a lesser extent, but I think all of us have that general dislike of authority. And in order to understand why it is that we should look at that maybe in a different way, we have to first understand, what is the goal? What is this all about? What did God make all this for? What's the universe exist for? What is the Trinity all about? What is all of this all about? And the answer from a biblical perspective seems to be that glory is the goal. Glory is what it's all about. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31 says, So, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. So whatever you're doing, whatever it is you're doing, make sure it's being done to the glory of God. So if it's not something that's going to glorify God, you ought not to be doing it. And when you are doing something, you ought to do it in such a fashion as to bring as much glory to God as possible. So the glorification of God is the whole point of everything. Now, you might say to yourself, well, that's, first of all, sounds weird. Secondly, that can't be right. And thirdly, I don't like that. Okay, that's fair. We're starting off on the right foot. Why is it that glory is the goal here? Well, you have to understand that glory is this concept that involves a lot of different aspects, but it's goodness, but it's not just goodness. It's wonder, but it's not just wonder. It's awe, but it's not just awe. It's fame, but it's not just fame. It's when you look at the idea of glory, it's like this scintillating, luminescent quality of all that is good and proper and holy. It's the shining aspect of everything that is superlative. You can't really. It's like it's saying that greatness is the goal. It's like saying that being the best is the goal. It goes without saying in a sense, and in the other sense you have to say it. Because the problem is that in our lives we often don't do that. We often don't have glory as the goal for our activities. How many of you guys ever, this is very confessional. If you feel brave enough to raise your hand, go ahead. If you don't, just mentally raise your hand if this applies to you. Do you ever do things for the purpose of comfort? Anyone? Anyone ever do that? You say to yourself, man, I'm tired today. I'm not going to do the plans that I had. You get up, it's a Saturday morning. It was a hard week at work. You say to yourself, man, I really should go out and mow the lawn. I really should, clean up the house. I really should do those kinds of things. But today, I just don't feel like it. Is that ever, anybody here ever done? I saw a couple hands. Thank you guys for your bravery. Okay. Here's the thing, right? If we're honest with ourselves, we often don't really care about glory as much as we care about ease, about comfort, about kind of doing what we feel like doing. And sometimes we feel energized, we feel motivated, and so we might, in some area of our life, we might really pursue glory. You might say to yourself, man, I want to play this piece of music. I want to learn the guitar. I want to become a woodworker, and I'm really motivated to make the best creation I can. And you have that in one part of your life, but then the rest of your life, or other parts of your life, what you do is you just kind of do what you feel like doing in the moment. And the reality is, in your heart, deep down inside, when you do that, you're selling yourself short. You know when you do that, right? And when people, if you've ever heard somebody come up to you and say, you could do better. If you've ever had somebody say that, if you ever had somebody say, you're not fulfilling your potential. Maybe you have a job. Man, I remember some jobs that I had back in the day that weren't very fun, and you'd go in, and sometimes you'd have those evaluations, and they'd say, you're really not fulfilling your potential. And there might be part of you that says, man, that makes me mad. But there's probably another part of you that says, that's probably true. And the thing is, when that happens, you never feel good about it, do you? You never go, wow, thank you very much. This has been the greatest job, review. This has been the best. I couldn't have hoped for a better outcome here. I'm going to go home and I'm going to feel good about myself all day long. Has anybody ever felt like that after hearing that? No, you don't, right? You know that, you don't even have to be told this, but you know that deep down in your heart, you know when you're doing it, and you know that there's something wrong with it. Now, you might give yourself excuses about why it's okay, and sometimes those excuses might be valid, but a lot of times we know that those excuses really aren't valid, that we're not living up to our potential, that we're not pursuing the best that we can, and that when we look at our lives in general, we have other goals other than the greatest good that is possible, that is glory. Now, why is that important? Because when we look at the book of Romans in chapter 3, verse 23, it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Falling short of the glory of God is sin. You see, we have a tendency to look at sin in a very narrow sense as just something that's kind of a moral issue. But sin is much more than just a moral issue. Sin is an issue of our entire lives. Sin is the lack of desire, the lack of ability, the lack of motivation, the lack of inclination, the lack of desire, and then the manifestation of all that, of falling short of God's glory, of not being the best that we can be. And you might say, well, what difference does that make? What difference does that make? Oh, it makes a world of difference. If you've ever had a relationship that was caustic, if you've ever had a relationship, maybe you came from a home where everything was great and glorious and wonderful, and everybody, it was the typical, Leave It to Beaver, Ward and June Cleaver family, and everybody, smiled and everybody was happy. That's great. But if you came from a family where things weren't like that, where things were maybe more dysfunctional, where things were difficult, maybe you have some really difficult memories of childhood. If you go back, do you think to yourself that the lack of a desire of people in the family to do the very best, to pursue their best, to do what they felt like doing instead of doing that, do you think that it mattered? If you look at our culture, if you look at our world, if you look at all that stuff, do you think that even if we could do let's say every one of us decided we could do 5% better in everything, what do you think that would happen? I was reading this article a few years ago, and they said that if we even had 2% better economies, if every year we compounded that 2%, so every year our economy was just 2% better than it has been. If everybody in our economy did 2% better, if we could be 2% more efficient, then instead of, at the time I was reading, we had a $16 trillion economy. Instead of having a $16 trillion economy at that time, just since World War II, we would have a $43 trillion economy. Can you believe that? Can you imagine being 3 times richer? Our whole economy being that means there'd be 3 times more money to spend on cancer research. And if all those cancer researchers were doing 2 or 5% better, if all of the families, if all of us were doing 5%, you know what I'm saying? That would be huge. It would be transformative of everything in our culture. Our families would be different. Our jobs would be different. Our wealth would be, everything would be different. You see, falling short of the glory of God is not a small thing, and it's the thing that ends up creating all the harm that we experience. But there's another aspect to this that's important, and that is in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. It says, "And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." So we all, with unveiled face, that means when you see God the way that He is. Remember last week we were talking about this idea of the veil being torn, and it gets torn when Jesus dies on the cross. When you have an unveiled face toward God, when your view of God is no longer veiled. You see, the problem is most of us go through our entire lives with a veil over our face when it comes to seeing God. We can't see God clearly. And in the Bible, that veil between us and God is torn the minute that Jesus dies for our sins. Because if you truly understand the fact that Jesus, the Son of God, died for your sins, and He was Himself God incarnate, then that transforms your view of who God is. That transforms your view of His love for you. That transforms your view of His intentions for you. That transforms His view, or your view, of His desires for your future. If you, for a moment, behold God with an unveiled face, if that veil of suspicion, if that veil of you suspect that He's tyrannical towards you, you suspect that He doesn't love you, you suspect that all He does is want to judge you, if that gets pulled apart, and for a moment you behold the glory of the Lord, His utmost goodness, what happens is that you start being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. You see, God's intention for us is that we reflect Him. He wants us to share in His glory. There's nothing better that God can give you. There's not one thing better that God could give you than to share in His glory. This is part of the process of creation. The Creator always imparts part of His glory to the creation. If you have a master sculptor and he does a piece of work and he does his best work, then he's imparting what? He's imparting all of his skill. Now, how many of you guys ever had art classes when you were young? Anybody here? Anybody here? Okay. How many of you guys, you look back at the things you did and you are as proud as you can be of those creations? Okay, if that was you, that's great. If you're like me, you look back at those things and you realize why you stopped doing it. Anybody here? Anybody here? See, if you're if you're a master sculptor, then what are you putting in? See, I'm not a master sculptor. If you have me up here doing a sculpture and you have a master sculptor doing a sculpture, the sculptures are going to be different, right? The sculptures are going to be different. Why? Because the master sculptor has a glory that he can impart to his sculpture. Where if I don't have that glory, I cannot impart that. So the sculpture doesn't get to share in my glory because I don't have it. When God creates us, He imparts some of His glory to us. It bears His image. Now the problem is that God, remember, creates with a word, and we don't all follow the word of God, and we don't all follow it to the extent that we could. And so, the amount of the glory that we bear changes depending on our response to the word. But the creation also then glorifies the Creator. If you've ever seen a really amazing sculpture, then you look at that and you say, wow, I wonder who did that. Wow, that person was amazing. Wow, that person. If you've ever heard just the most inspiring piece of music, you say, wow, who created that? How could they have done that? And so these two things, they share in each other's glory, right? Because the glory of the Creator imparts His glory to the creation, and then the creation then turns around and shares in His glory and glorifies the Creator. This is what it is all about. And if you ask, well, why is this what it's all about? The answer is love. The reason that it is all about glory is because the most glorious thing, the most glorious aspect of God is His love. You see, in the realm of God's glory, there are many things. There are many aspects of God's glory. There is His wisdom. There is His power. There is His discernment. There is His justice. But perhaps the greatest is His love. And because God loves us, He wants to impart His glory to us. There is nothing better for Him than the joy of imparting His glory to us. To have something share in your glory is a true joy for those who love what is good. And we know that this is true because we enjoy doing it. From gardening in your backyard to raising children, we know the joy of imparting glory. Man, if you like to fish, then you know the joy of learning the whole art of fishing. And if any of you guys ever saw the movie A River Runs Through It, it's a great movie about kind of this joy in the art of fishing. And so this character who is a pastor and who loves to fish, he has two sons and he sets about teaching them to fish. Right? Why is he going to teach them to fish? Because of the joy of sharing in His glory. He knows the glory of fishing and he wants to share that with his sons. And so throughout the movie at different ages, the sons are there fishing with their father because they're sharing in the glory. We all, if we are good, we love to share. And it's love that compels the creation of glory in another. It's love for the sons that makes the father who loves to fish want to teach them to fish. He loves them, and so he wants them to share in something glorious. This is authorship. You are authoring glory in somebody else. And that is where we get the idea of authority. Authority is the authorship of glory in somebody else. Now the problem is that most of us, most of the time, we don't think of authority this way. Most of us, most of the time, we have a negative view towards authority. But if we understood authority from the biblical perspective, and we understood that God has instituted authority for the purpose of authoring glory in you, if you really got a hold of that concept, you would have a far different view of authority. You would run to authority. You would love authority. You would wish for authority to happen over you so that somebody could author glory into your life. It involves discipline. And discipline is the use of reward and punishment in a substitutionary way. What do I mean by that? I mean this: that the person who is going to author glory in somebody else, what they do is they use reward and punishment in a way that's a substitution. So how many of you guys ever, anybody here, were you guys ever in sports? Any sports yet? How many of you guys had coaches that were tough? Anybody have tough coaches? Okay. And the tough coaches were the ones that really would get the most out of you, right? And the thing is that I remember times when we didn't have, when I was in football, one of the things our coaches were all in on us, they wanted us to be aggressive. They wanted us to hit somebody. And if you hit the wrong person, that was not as bad as not hitting anybody, right? Like, you could tackle the wrong guy. He didn't even have the ball. And you would get in much less trouble than if you stood there and didn't know who to tackle, so you didn't tackle anybody. Like, if you didn't know who to tackle, just tackle somebody. Because if you fail to tackle somebody, you're getting in big trouble. And the big trouble was this. They would get us in a big circle. And there would be the guy who didn't hit anybody in the middle. And everybody would be around him. And our coach would call out a name, and that person would run at you full force. And you didn't know where that person was in the circle unless you had a really good memory. And so you were constantly looking around trying to figure out where was this going to come from. And hopefully you got turned around, because if not, you were just going to get run over. And you would have to hit that guy. And then he'd call somebody else's name. And you're looking around and you're going to hit that guy. And this would go on as long as the coach thought, until you had built up the necessary aggressiveness. Now here's the thing. Why did they do that? Would that ever happen in a football game? If you failed to tackle somebody, would the other team get to go in a circle around? No. He's using a punishment that you can understand readily right now for a punishment that you can't understand readily. And it's the same thing with reward. When you're building in reward systems for somebody, you're trying to set up a reward that is as close to the natural reward as possible, so that they start to get the flavor of the benefit of having glory built into their lives. You see, you build in something that's as analogous to the problem of not having glory, so they can experience that, and then you build into their life something that's as analogous to the reward, so they can build that. You remember, we've talked about the parable that Jesus tells of the talents. And you remember that he says to the people he gives money to, and they go out and invest it, he says, come and enter into your master's joy. You see, ultimately, when you have glory built into your life, you don't need those substitutes anymore, because you understand and live the real rewards. You see, what's happening here is that when you understand the real rewards, you're living the real rewards, you don't need the substitutes anymore. You don't need that anymore. You know, the funny thing is that my sons, when they were younger, I had to really be on them to remember to brush their teeth. Man, I had to be on them all the time. I want to tell you this. I do not do that anymore. I don't call them up every night and say, hey, have you brushed your teeth? Did you wash your face? Are you going to get tucked in? I don't do any of that, right? Why? I don't do that anymore, because the thing is that if I have done my job correctly, then at this point in their life, they should be entering into the master's joy. They should be entering into the joy of wanting the reward that's natural. You see, authority exists only when someone has something to give. Authorship can only occur when you have some glory to write into the life of someone else. Now, here's the situation that we have in this text, is that the centurion has more political and military power than Jesus could ever have, but that centurion can do nothing for the well-being of his servant. All the military power in the world, the fact that he has command over 100 other soldiers, all of that does nothing. His servant is dying of a disease that's way too small for him to exercise his power against. He has no ability to deal with this problem, and so he goes to Jesus, the one he knows has authority over this problem. Jesus has a blessing that he can give. He has a blessing that he can write into the life of this person. Now, one of the interesting things about this passage is that the centurion will not let Jesus enter his home. And so what you see here is somebody who truly understands authority and the nature of authority. You see, authority is not dealt with all in the same strata. It's multifaceted. What it means is that just because somebody has authority in one area doesn't mean that they have authority in another area. This Roman centurion could order Jesus to carry a load for him. He has authority over Jesus in that way. But he goes to Jesus as somebody who is under authority. In fact, the fact that he won't let Jesus enter his house means that he understands that as a Jew, Jesus cannot enter into the house by custom of this centurion without becoming unclean. And because he has respect for that, rather than say, well, that's not fair, or that's not right, or I don't like that, he says, I will respect that because I know that you have authority in another realm. I know that you have authority on another plane. And authority is God's way of building glory in you. When you're under authority, think about the authorship of glory in you. Even a boss that isn't great can author glory in you. So let's look at point number 2. Faith equals trust, and the love equals authority and submission. So because God loves us, He wants to build glory in our lives. His authority is the authorship of that glory in our lives, and our submission is the acceptance of that glory. And so to have great faith means to trust in that process. It's interesting here that he says, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly. And Jesus says, I will come and heal him. But the centurion replied, Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. And then he says, but only say the word and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. And another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. The commendation of faith comes after the soldier expresses something profoundly important. And that's not just the fact that Jesus is who he says he is. He not only understands that Jesus is who he says he is, but he understands the nature of the reality that God has constructed and the motivations therein. What does his faith consist of? It's very sophisticated. He says, I am a man under authority who has authority over other people. What has Jesus been saying? In John chapter 6:38, this guy has either been following Jesus, heard a lot about Jesus, or pays attention very well. Because if you look at John 6:38, this is an example of some of the things that Jesus says throughout his ministry here on earth. It says, for I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of who sent me. I'm not here to do what I want to do. I'm here to follow the will of my Father. I'm in submission to the will of my Father. You see, what this centurion, who is a Gentile, understands is that authority is always derived from somebody else until you get to the very top, until you get to the Father, until you get to the author of all things. Now, Jesus is not underneath God. He's not God Jr. But Jesus is fulfilling also the role of mankind to its fullest, which means that he is submission, full stop. It's interesting, isn't it, that we look at submission as such an insult. Don't we? I mean, let's be real. Let's be honest here. We look at submission as an insult. And yet, somehow, Jesus did not see it that way. Jesus did not see his submission to the Father as an insult. He didn't seem to be bothered by it. He didn't seem to chafe under it. He didn't seem to have an attitude about it. Submission carries no insult here. Because you can never gain any authority by rebelling against authority. In fact, your authority comes from submission to authority, always. Here's the thing that I see a lot is that people want to rebel to the authority above them and then turn around and practice authority over the people below them. It never works that way. It cannot work that way. Your authority always comes from your submission to a higher authority. I was thinking about this the other day. I was reading this story. I think I've mentioned it to you guys before, but it came back to mind something I was reading where there was a guy who was in special forces, and he bought a house in a really bad part of this town that he was living in. And basically, he reported to the cops some drug activity that was going on, and the gang that was in that area found out about it, and so they threatened to come back and deal with them. And so he said, hey, be here at 5 o'clock on this night. I'll deal with you. And then what happened was he went back to the base that he was at, and he got all of his buddies together and said, why don't you come have a barbecue and bring all the guns you have? And so that's what they did. And so these gangsters went to break into his house and kill him, and they were met with about 10 guys who started shooting at them, and it didn't go very well for them. And what was interesting to me is to think about the dynamics, the difference in dynamics between, somebody who's maybe a street thug and somebody who's, say, a private, right? Because the thing about being a street thug is that you don't have to be in submission to anyone. You can even not be in a gang. You can just be that local guy who decides to beat up on everybody he comes across and does whatever he wants. You can be that guy. And you have nobody telling you what to do. You don't bow the knee to anybody. You don't submit to anybody. And you're full of how your vim and vigor and how tough and strong you are. And the thing that's different between him and the private in the army is the private in the army has to take orders from everybody. But you know what's interesting is in a big enough fight, who do you want to be? Do you want to be the corner thug, or do you want to be the private in the army? Because one of them can call in airstrikes, and the other one can't. And you might say to me, well, privates aren't given the responsibility of calling in this. Fair enough. But a private can tell a sergeant, hey, these guys are shooting at me. We should probably get an airstrike. And then the sergeant could talk to the air ground communicator guy. That's their official title. And then they can call in an airstrike. But the corner thug just can't, right? The corner thug, once he's exhausted the power of his own fists, he's useless. You see, the point here is so important for us to understand, is that submission doesn't carry a lowering of power and freedom and glory, but an elevation of those things. I've told you about how I was always jealous of my cousin. We went up to their cabin one time, and he was listening to the radio. My cousin was a professional musician, and I when I was a kid, I wanted to do that too because I thought he was just the coolest guy around. And so what he would do is, while he was listening to the radio, or we were all listening to the radio in a room, he was reading the paper while he was doing that, is a song would come on, and I would say, hey, can you play that? And he would just reach over with one hand, he'd keep reading the paper, and he'd reach over to the piano, and he'd play it with one hand. And I always thought, man, that is so cool. That is so amazing to have the freedom and the power just to be able to do that. Just to be able to reach over without even thinking about it or anything, just play whatever you're hearing. How did he get that way? Because he submitted. He submitted to his teachers. And those teachers, the only reason they had power or authority, the only way that they could author glory into his life is they were submitted to other teachers and ultimately submitted to the ideas, the principles, the foundational aspects of music. We often make no progress in our faith because we don't trust submission. And I can't say how important that is. We make no progress in our faith because we have no trust in submission. That is what the centurion was commended for, and often that's what we lack. In Romans chapter 13, verse 1 and 2, it says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists these authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." Do you see how pointed that is? I hope you caught that. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. There is no authority except from God. There is no authorship except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Now you say, well, they don't know the kind of authorities that I have. They don't know the boss that I have. They don't know that, right? Paul was writing this while dealing with a Roman authority that was far more corrupt than we could imagine. An authority that took Jesus' life and then would eventually take his. And what does he say? He says, there's no authority except what God is into. Well, how do we square this? Well, there is an exception in Acts chapter 5. Verse 27 through 29, it says, "And when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, 'We strictly charge you not to teach in this name, yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us.' But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than men.'" You see, the principle is always when the authorship of a lower authority in your life is contradictory to something that is higher in your life, then you're obligated to follow the authorship of the higher authority. That's always the way that it works. But does that mean that you don't follow anything in the authority that's been wrong? No. You follow them in everything except that which conflicts with the higher authority. If you have a boss at work that's telling you to break the law, you say, nope. Why? Because there's a higher authority than you, the state. And if the state tells you to do something that God forbids you to do, then you say no. Why? Because they're not exercising authority at that point. It's your job to be under authority. So let's finally wrap up really quickly. Authority and submission. Authority equals submission plus time. How does God prepare you for authority? He prepares you for authority with submission. Man, this is so important. Now, the thing is, for most of us, I remember when I was a kid, I thought I knew way more than I did, and I wanted to be an authority over things, and I couldn't wait to be an authority over things. You know how you get to be an authority over things? You submit to authority. Why? How can you author glory into somebody's life if glory hasn't been authored into yours? You see, you have to submit to authority so that glory can be authored into your lives, so that you can become glorious to the point where you have something to offer, to author into somebody else's life. Man, how many times when you were a kid did you think you knew what the bosses should be doing? Anybody have those recollections, like your first job, and you knew what your bosses should be doing, and you knew what this person should be doing, and you knew what that person should be doing, and you knew what the president of the corporation should be doing, and you knew right? And the thing is that you didn't have a clue. And your boss probably came to you and said, hey, how about just sweeping the floor correctly? How about fixing that first? And then worry about the board of directors. Straighten them out after you've cleaned the floor. Is that a deal? Well, you haven't been under authority long enough to have anything to offer. This is true with King David. He shows himself to be submissive before he's handed the throne. But it also is true in the life of Jesus. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 8 through 10, it says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth." All authority is given to Jesus because he's lived life in perfect submission to the Father, and so therefore becomes the author of all things. We always talk about believing, belonging, and becoming. So what do we need to do to apply this? I want to ask a few questions here. Feel free to raise your hand or not as you see fit. How many of us here today are Christians? Anyone? If you're a Christian, how many of you guys believe Romans chapter 13? Anyone? Anyone believe Romans chapter 13? You believe that that's true? That God has instituted authority and that we are supposed to submit to authorities? I want to ask you this last question. Are you making it look good? Are you making it look good? Are you making it look attractive? Are you making it look beautiful? Are you making submission to authority look good and wonderful? Are you making having authority look good in the areas where you have authority? Because the reality is that the next generation of people and the generation that are all around you will get their ideas of the benefits of authority and submission based on the way that we as Christians live. Jesus has come to author glory into our lives. He has come to make his home with us.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to his church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.